that was one of the really cool things about this story that I was able to find is it's not just a sports story, but it touches on civil rights, touches on women's issues, and it's about the power of a team and working together and what you can accomplish when you lift each other up and when you don't hold anyone back. And so there are a lot of things that get packed into this, inspirational sports story.
Yeah, what made you interested in doing the Tigerbelles? Did you look at other teams, or you right away knew you wanted to do them?
Well, I grew up in Nashville, which is where the Tigerbelles are from, and my grandfather was actually a track coach at Vanderbilt, which was across town from Tennessee State, and that was when all the schools in the Southeast especially were segregated still. And he heard about this team around the corner that was producing these incredible athletes, and he invited them to come and practice on their track because they had a track that only went halfway around. Can you imagine? They were going to the Olympics and they didn't have a track that went all the way around, and Vanderbilt had a nice track, and their best athlete, he won the SEC for long jump, and Ralph Boston, I don't know if you know who he was. Did you see him in the photos? But he actually won the gold medal that same year in 1960 for long jump. But when he came over with the Tigerbelles to practice on Vanderbilt's track, and the SEC champion, his name was Kurt Russ, and he jumped, his championship jump, and then Ralph Boston jumped 2 feet longer than him. They were just that much better. And anyway, my dad was on that team with him as well. And so I grew up knowing about the Tigerbelles, and I just felt like as I got older and realized that other people didn't know who they were, that I felt like other people could be inspired by them, like I always had been. So
That's cool.
I felt like it should be shared.
Yeah. And so did you end up spending a lot of times in the library? And
Yes, lots
Archives.
of time in the library. Yeah, lots of libraries, lots of online, and also pestering people with access to old videos and. Sorry, yeah, so I got there's a man named Dwight Lewis, and he went to Tennessee State just a few years after 1960. I think he started there in 1964, and then he spent his whole career working for the Tennessean. He was a multi-award-winning journalist for the Tennessean, and he had throughout his life interviewed because he's a sports fan. He interviewed all the Tennessee State athletes, and he just had these archives, and he was so generous to share. Once I got Dwight on board, I felt like, okay, he knew what I was doing, and he was on board, and so that was huge, just getting some of those old interviews, because when they're older, they're looking back and they're fine with things. They'll tell you what happened, but they've made peace with things. And when they're younger, if there's something that was really bothering them, they're much more likely to tell you. So those concurrent interviews that Dwight captured were so valuable. And they would get into a lot of dirt about like the rivalries among the team members, but still how much they loved each other. And so it was wonderful. Well, one thing that was unique about the 1960 Olympics is that they were the first televised Olympics. So that was the first time that people were, especially people of color, were seeing themselves on TV. And young women were seeing that they could participate in sports in a way that they hadn't before. My aunt was telling me about how when she knew that the Tigerbelles would come and practice on Vanderbilt Stadium, because at the stadium she lived on campus, and she would run over because she didn't think that girls were supposed to run, and she wanted to run just like her brother did. And so that Olympics being televised was, I think, really important. There's still a lot of tension with Russia in 1960, so that was a really important aspect, competing against the Russian athletes who were pretty much state-sponsored athletes, and they were competing against, all the sprinters and, all the kind of marquee athletes on the track team all came from this one little university that had zero support. And just to see that disparity of what they could do in their performance. So and then also they were still in the height of the Jim Crow South. So they were showing what people of color could do, what Black people in the South could do. And then they won gold medals for their country and then came back and they were still segregated. They still couldn't eat in all the restaurants. Wow. But that year, 1960, was really pivotal because that was when there was a man named James Lawson who was at the Divinity School at Vanderbilt, and he was training students to do the counter-protest. And he was expelled from Vanderbilt because the board didn't like all the, stirring up trouble. And then the students and a lot of the faculty protested that expulsion. So at Vanderbilt, there was that tension. But at Tennessee State was a state university, so they were state funded. And they were wanting to participate in the sit-ins. John Lewis was one of the students that was doing the sit-ins there too. And but because they were threatened with their funding from the state, the head of school, the president, Walter Davis, said that if they participated, if they got arrested, then they'd lose their athletic scholarship, their eligibility. They have work aid scholarships, and they couldn't afford that. And they also figured that was and their coach Temple, really counseled them that their best way to really protest was to show the world what they were capable of. But that was a really tough decision. Lucinda Williams was one of the people on that relay team. She talked about that later in her life, that was one of her biggest regrets, was not being able to participate in those protests. And that was happening in 1960 when they were preparing to go to the Olympics. So, they're not just athletes trying to do their best, and that's the only thing they had to focus on, but they had world-altering events that were in their backyard. And so 1960 was a really consequential year, and all of that happening in the Olympics. And so that was one of the really cool things about this story that I was able to find is it's not just a sports story, but it touches on civil rights, touches on women's issues, and it's about the power of a team and working together and what you can accomplish when you lift each other up and when you don't hold anyone back. And so there are a lot of things that get packed into this, inspirational sports story.
How many of them were you able to interview, like of the 30 or 40 women?
Oh, no, not that many. I wish. There weren't that many that are still alive. I talked to two of the main Tigerbelles, and I talked to family members, and I talked to Ralph Boston, who I would like to write a book on him. He's incredible. He just passed away last year too, unfortunately. And I talked to Coach Temple, and I talked to the current coach of the Tigerbelles, who was a Tigerbelle herself, Chandra Cheeseborough. So I talked to a lot of the students. I talked to Ed Temple's daughter, Edwina, who was on the tape. I talked to a lot of the people that were just at the school at the time, and just